Hello everyone, I'm back. so, so, are the odds stacked against women in science? The answer, obviously and unfortunately, is yes. So over the next 30 minutes, we are going to discuss these gender gaps in science and possibly explore solutions for the way ahead. So I think it was in late 2025 that Nandita and Aashima started visiting, late 2015, yes, I'm sorry, late 2015 that Nandita and Aashima started visiting labs of women researchers and scientists across the country. And their book Lab Hopping is a culmination of hundreds of conversations that they've had with these women. And so to begin with, I want to talk about Mangalyaan. So it was not only about successfully launching the Mars orbiter into space, but at the same time, that particular event also had a very cultural significance in the sense that there was an image of women in ISRO celebrating that sort of went viral and sort of became representative of the Mangalyaan mission, of the Mars orbiter mission. And very recently in Chandrayaan as well, with the successful Chandrayaan mission, we also saw a lot of images of women in ISRO, and there were articles and photographs talking about the contribution of women scientists. So the first question that I want to ask Nandita and Aashima is that what do these cultural moments signify?
Yeah, I think this picture, I hope people know what we're talking about. This image with women celebrating in brightly colored saris and gajras at, these ISRO women. That image went really, really viral, and everybody liked it, shared it. The media, of course, covered just the existence of this image a lot. And we thought, while we were on the journey to find Indian women scientists, we thought that it was very interesting the way we reacted to it culturally, like the way media reacted to it. Because I think there is the story of, it's very telling of the bias that we have against women scientists, because this idea of Indian women in science is very significant for us to observe the bias come to play, even though it was a positive reaction. And of course, then Chandrayaan happened, and like ISRO women have become quite popular now, thanks to that image, and also the contributions of lots of women engineers and scientists doing all the awesome things that India is doing in space. And in Chandrayaan, again, the same image surfaced. So we tried to find out who these women are, because we were looking for women scientists, and actually they're not the ones that are directly involved with the science of ISRO. They were admin staff at ISRO. And this image again was used in Chandrayaan again to talk about women scientists at ISRO. So I find it really interesting how we all reacted to it. Of course, also international media, I think there was coverage of that image. There was a headline that BBC did, how to cook curry and, yeah. So that's the way we're talking about Indian women and, highly tech spaces also very interesting, I think, and very telling of the bias. So that's...
Right. So we'll talk a little bit more in detail about these bias and prejudices that play out against women in science. But before that, I want you to sort of give us a brief about the genesis of this book. This book is a result of the Life of Science project that Nandita and Aashima had undertaken. So can you give us like a brief about what this entire project was all about, and maybe we could also read a short excerpt from the book to set the tone for the rest of the conversation.
The lifeofscience.com is a media platform. We call it a feminist science multimedia platform, and we started it in 2016 when both Aashima and I due to various circumstances that we actually talk about in the introduction of the book, we decided to start this thing. We had time on our hands and we were young, and we and we both like to travel, so we decided that we do this sort of traveling media project where we would visit laboratories situated in various parts of the country, including parts that you don't usually associate with science, places like Bangalore and many of the other metro cities we think of when we think of science. But we also visited places like Kalimpong in West Bengal, and Aluva in Kerala, and Ajmer. And all these places where we don't usually associate science with, but there were laboratories that were working there, and there were people that were doing different kinds of science there. And to our surprise, there were women in most of these places doing science there, because we came with this idea, and I think a lot of us also growing up, we don't get to see, there aren't a lot of women in science visible to us, whether it's in movies or newspapers or wherever. So that gives us this impression that there are far too few of them. But we found that while they were still a minority, there were enough women in science, and we started documenting their work, the kind of research that they've been doing, and also their trajectories and the kinds of journeys that they've been having. And through that we started understanding a lot of patterns. Many of them were having common kinds of obstacles in their scientific path, and also the diversity of experiences also was really mind-boggling to us, because we were looking at women in science as sort of one entity, and we realized that the range of challenges, the range of privilege, the range of experiences that women we were talking to had were just far too diverse to homogenize them in the way maybe we naively started doing. And this book, Lab Hopping, and also a previous book we've co-written together called 31 Fantastic Adventures in Science, which I believe is also in the store, are both both offshoots of the project, though this, I think, is a little more kind of a distillation, we call it sometimes, an investigative look into the gender gap of Indian science.
Right. So, Aashima, would you go ahead and read the excerpt? I think this is about Gagandeep Kang, who is one of the most prominent virologists in India.
Yeah. Just a brief intro about what I'm going to read. This is from the chapter, The Old Boys Club. And here is a few things that Gagandeep told us. She was one of the few people who really was able to comment and also quantify the kind of deceleration she had in her scientific career as a woman. So she said, told us just in the part before I'm about to read, that her being a woman caused a 5 to 6 year delay in where she has reached, which is really the top. So she explains this 5 to 6 year delay by saying, if you compare the support that is given to faculty members at early stages in their career in terms of travel opportunities, lab space, and consumables, you can see that women usually get just 2/3 or less in every sphere than men in their career. This is true when it comes to opportunities to build your scientific network as well. It's who you take to meetings with you. Men are more likely to take younger men than women to professional meetings that would result in exposure and advancement. So it takes women longer to build networks. And then there are opportunities for sitting on committees, for being part of a team that sets up the guidelines that give you a standing in the field. The number of women being put forward to participate in those is very few. It is required for women to be at a much higher level to begin participating in decision-making positions, Gagandeep said. In 1992, when she was starting a research project to characterize various pathogens, polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, was being established in labs across the world. PCR is the same nucleic acid amplifying biotechnology that COVID-19 has made familiar. The technique was just beginning to be used in biotech. There was almost nobody in India, she says, who had a PCR machine. At CMC Vellore, where she did her PhD, there came an opportunity to get trained in running PCR tests. Also eligible to travel abroad for this training was a male colleague. This person doing work in chemical biology space. Now to the question, who is more relevant for the opportunity? Very clearly, it should have been me. Instead of which, our man gets to go for the training program and never uses PCR after that. Okay, she continued. I finally learned PCR 6 years later after I went to London for a postdoc. And if I had learned it before, I could have used it for my previous work. That investment in me would have yielded much greater returns. I could have gotten to where I am now much earlier. Yeah, that didn't happen, she summed up.
I think there are so many of these everyday challenges and prejudices that women in science have to navigate, which the men just don't. Yeah. But I think the metric that's set for them in order to say measure how successful they are or how productive they are, etc., is the same as men. When the challenges that they have to face is just not the same. Yeah. And from your book, there are a lot of conversations that you've had with many of these women where they say that working in the lab under such circumstances can become a particularly isolating experience, and especially if you add an intersectionality lens to it. I think the patriarchy and the prejudice, it can sometimes lead to people not being understood and lead to people feeling that they are not being heard. So what are some of these observations and conversations that you've had?
Maybe I'll start with one anecdote that I remember, because every time we talk about isolation, I always think about this one conversation I had with an astronomer in Osmania University in Hyderabad. And she told me how the circumstances by which she was hired into her department. She was the first ever woman to be part of Osmania's actually very prestigious astronomy department. And she was hired into a place that had people who had taught her earlier. So it was her own professors, and she was very young. She had not got a PhD yet. And she said the atmosphere was extremely hostile. Her professors clearly resented that now they had to sit side by side to her, and she was not given an she was finally on persuading, she was given an office which she said was on a floor where nothing else happened, and it was right near the toilets, and there were mice when she moved in there. She was not given a computer because they said we didn't have computers when we started our career, so you have to learn it this way as well. And her confidence took a really hard beating. So of course, this is one of the, I think, more extreme cases of the kind of isolation faced not just by women, but by people coming from any sort of marginalized or minority group in science. And I think in science, sometimes it's a lot stronger than it is in society. We have a tendency to think that science is above society, does not suffer the biases that regular society faces because, you know, we're smart and we're objective and meritorious. But in contrast, it's sometimes amplified because science has this sheen of protectiveness where nobody is. We're not encouraged to question science or scientists. They're seen as, you know, people who are at another level on a pedestal. So because of that, they get away with a lot. And that is also why we discovered over our conversations that gender really was only one of the many axes of marginalizations affecting scientists. Even within women scientists, that you find much fewer. If you start, you know, looking at caste, which is a big other factor, the number of Brahmin and upper caste women in science are disproportionately high, and there are very, very few women coming from a lot of other communities. And when this is the conditions, when, you know, in a lot of our colleges, there's almost no Dalit Bahujan or Adivasi, so even disabled scientists. Many of these groups are completely underrepresented. So even the students that come there end up being extremely isolated. And we can see, you know, in some of our best institutes, the kind of mental health crisis that is happening, the kind of every other day. I think just a few days back, there was a death in the Indian Institute of Science. I was reading in the paper today. I don't know the details of that, but there's enough to know that there's something wrong, that our young academics are not entering a healthy space. And I think maybe a lot of that might have to do with the isolation.
Yeah. In fact, that sort of brings me to my next question. One of the things that I really like about the book is the fact that it does not approach this in any sort of binary. It's not like, okay, there is men in one box versus women in the other. There is a lot of intersectionality to the narrative in the book. And as you rightly said, many of these people, especially from, say, marginalized communities, or if we talk about, say, transgender individuals in science, they might not have support from the get-go, yet even if they pursue a career in the science, braving all the odds, despite not having family systems to support them, how do we make sure that at an institutional level, at a systemic level, they get the support that they get? Like when they go into if they become a part of an institution, how can that institution provide them the kind of support that they need?
I think the institutes in our country have a lot of work cut out for them, because currently the scenario is not really good, because these are there's a lot of gatekeeping. And especially with science and academia, as Nandita said, you know, we like to think of the community as very objective, as very refined, etc. But it's quite the opposite, because I think the culture inside institutes is quite sold into scientism. It's kind of trying to emulate what's happening in the West without translation into, you know, our own realities here. So yeah, I think just even the laws, like daycare centers, the basics are really not really, you know, we haven't covered them yet. A lot of our reporting actually led to a few daycares being set up at very, you know, institutes where you'd expect there have been daycare centers for a long time, but we were surprised to find in our lab hopping journey that this is not true. I think the hope from this book really is to kind of have the conversation about our science culture, our culture of knowledge making being very, very narrow, and to open it up, really. And there's a lot to be done. There are very small, like all movements in India, there are pockets of, you know, people shaking their fists. And I think it also is more scientific to be more diverse. Like if you have a diversity of ideas, you are doing better science. So it's just good sense to open up the culture. We also kind of like to celebrate the slog of science. So at any renowned institute that you go to, at ISC or the TFRs or even the IITs, you know, the weekend slogging in the lab till 3 a.m. is, you know, acknowledged, and, you know, you get glorified. And this is quite toxic. And this is also because of this kind of culture, a lot of women usually hold many, many identities. And to just identify only as a scientist is not afforded by most women. Of course, there are women in science, as we have found out, many, many. But the door is not open, I have to say, and the struggle has been going on since, you know, the end of the 19th century, where women were, for the first time, allowed into these temples of learning. And there was, you know, people like Kamala Soni who staged Satyagraha at the gates of IISc, for women to be allowed in. And I think this ask to open up science and to even get deeper into what diversity means, what openness means, needs to be discovered and rediscovered in our science community. And I think the young people today, especially in this climate, I think the students that enter these institutes, I'm standing right behind them. The feminists that we've spoken to write this book, to investigate this book, we're standing behind them because a lot of people actually have been calling for an open culture for a very long time, and I think we should finally get closer to that soon.
Right. So we have about 10 minutes to go.
Yeah.
So I have two last questions, after which we will open the discussion out to the audience in case you have questions. So Nandita and Aashima, where's the data? Like, for example, if do these institutions collect the required amount of data, gender aggregated data, or even at the government level? For example, if you have, say, schemes or policies that say there are X number of chairs that will be allocated to women, or if there is a policy that sort of helps women come back to science, careers in science after a gap. Is there data that could help us analyze what's going right, whether this is really working, what the picture is? And if there's no data, what can we do about it? How can that issue be solved, even starting from the institutional level?
There is definitely a lack. I mean, there is not enough data for sure, but there is also a lot of data. So there is enough data for every institute, for every underrepresented, institute that suffers from some kind of a gender gap or a caste gap to, commission maybe a project by a group of social scientists to look at their numbers and figure out what is going on and how we can get out of this. But at the same time, we very, very rarely do we see that kind of engagement with the numbers happening. There's one particular scheme called Gati, which has been recently launched, where they are really pushing for our top science institutes to start, at least now, collecting this data of, gender breakup and many other kinds of criteria also, so that at least that serves as a starting point. But, we also discussed some of these upcoming schemes in the book and how even they have problems. A lot of the time, we only see the numbers coming out, the numbers that kind of make us feel good. For example, there is a scheme that was running for many years. Now, I'm not very sure, it might have been revised, but it was dubbed a break-in career scheme. So it was for scientists who had, a lot of women scientists have to take breaks in their career and they're never able to come back. So the scheme was targeted at these women who had to take breaks for whatever reason, but often motherhood or family related, but to give them a grant to enable them to come back. So we have some numbers which we often see the government on Women's Day saying that, 2,000, 3,000 women have come back to science thanks to the scheme. But what they don't tell us is, now it's been more than 10, 15 years, I think, that the scheme has been running, but how many of those women are still in science now? And when we talk to women who have received these schemes, we found out that a majority of them, very, very few of them, after the 3 years of the grant, find jobs. Yeah. So it's just like we're giving them one cookie, like, okay, do research for 3 more years, but after that you have no hope because
there's no long-term
there is no long-term thought. So those numbers tracking, these schemes and their performance are really lacking, and any sort of critical critiquing of a lot of these moves is also discouraged.
Yeah. While we're talking about data, also I want to make 2 comments very quickly. One is this ask for data is one of the big, actually, barriers in the conversation about gender in science, because the authorities are always saying, okay, this gender vendor is enough, but give us data. Also, like I said, science community likes to see itself as very objective. So there is a very famous quote from a physicist who stood up at CERN and said, the data doesn't lie, women don't like physics. You know, because in the data you don't see them, but the stories are really behind, and the stories are really in this book. The stories are behind the data, why we don't have the data. The second point is the way we are collecting data also needs some kind of revision, because we're looking at gender also in a very binary way, and gender is not binary. By now we all know that. And all our recent schemes are also very shy of seeing gender as it is, even though we have many sociologists, gender activists, transgender people talking and engaging with these issues, but finally what comes out really is still in the gender binary, and that's not helping anything. So if our data remains in the binary, we will still have binary institutions, and that's not helping diversity.
Right.